Hi everyone, Kenneth Martin here from Block Architects. I'm joined today with John Burns, who is the Passivhaus specialist in Block Architects. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Kenny.
John, there's a lot of confusion and I suppose mystery out there about what Passivhaus is all about. As our in-house consultant and specialist, what in your view is Passivhaus?
So basically, the Passivhaus system is a building that is 90% more efficient than your standard building under the current building regulations. All of these 5 key principles are linked together. Without one, the system falls down. And this is one of the areas in terms of a normal house that you don't get the standard, because you might have under the current regulations a well insulated property, but it might fall down on having poor windows or bad detailing where you get thermal bridging throughout the construction, which means that although the client thinks they're getting a nice brand new house, the detailing within the construction of the timber kit or at the windows is that badly built that they end up heating the house more because of the way it's been built.
So Passivhaus is something that's mooted to be under some great evolution in Scotland. So what does that mean to the average person then who's looking at potentially building a new Passivhaus or potentially looking at a Passivhaus building? What does that necessarily mean for them right now?
If they were to want to build a Passivhaus, it would generally, there's the 2 means of why you would want to do it. Is you want to save money in terms of your performance of the building, but also for the comfort of the house. So like we mentioned previously, the comfort of the house, you think when you're building a new built house that it's going to be energy efficient, but you would end up with a house, if it's badly built, that actually might be drafty, or it could be very noisy. And one of the key things that you get within a Passivhaus is a significant increase in the comfort level within the house.
Right. Okay. So on that basis, then, what is it like to live in a Passivhaus?
Well, if you take, for example, your living rooms are generally within the houses that we design. There's a lot of open plan living, and sometimes within open plan living, it can be quite drafty. If it's a large space, you got a lot of cross ventilation in terms of maybe a window on the other side has been badly built. Then that space in there will be thermally stable. The surfaces within that room will be consistent. There won't be any cold spots within the walls. The actual furniture, the tables, the kitchen worktops will all be a stable temperature. So as a whole, the building feels, again, the word, more comfortable than a normal house would be.
It's interesting because there's a lot of people out there, there's a mixed feeling, and to some extent there's nothing we can do about it because the regulations are coming for Passivhaus in Scotland and in England. We're going to have to respond to it and deal with it. But there's a lot of people out there who might say that, well, they like ventilation and fresh air in their buildings, and certainly as we're designing more and more airtight houses, condensation is becoming a big risk. So I'm assuming that's where the heat recovery system comes in.
Yeah, so the MVHR system is there to provide, again, a stable temperature within the building, but also it reduces the risk of mould, reduces the risk of bad odours throughout the property. It reduces the risk of mildew within the property. So what you end up in terms of an existing house that you might be building presently, the condensation within that house will be quite high, and the MVHR system controls that. Basically, it's a balanced system. It uses part of the heating that's coming into the building. It uses the MVHR to temper that, and it basically provides a nice, stable and constant temperature within the property with fresh air using.
Okay. So what's your view then on that? There's also trying to iron out some of the questions that some of our clients might have. What's your view on, particularly when we're recording this today, it's freezing outside. So what's your view on using MVHR systems in Scotland?
So the actual system itself is there to temper the temperature within the actual system. So the building is going to be a stable temperature just because of the way it's been constructed. The airtight membrane, the well insulated property means that the building itself, the temperature doesn't depreciate as drastically as a new built house would be. So the difference from internal to external doesn't drastically change over a short period of time. It's very stable in terms of the way it loses its temperature over a length of time. So you might not have any heating on, and so the MVHR is there. It's just a way of making sure that the temperature that's coming into the building is that it's stable, so you're not bringing in super cold air into the property. It's just there using the heat within the property itself to temper that, bring it back up to the house temperature.
Okay. Used to be a similar kind of theories with underfloor heating, I suppose. You know, we used to think that it used to take a long time to heat the building up using underfloor heating, but in some respects, modern systems can temper that air much more efficiently now.
Yeah.
So more and more people are using that as well. In terms of passive house then, and the challenges of construction, what do you feel, maybe even design as well, the challenges of design and construction, what are the most challenging aspects of that?
So it's slightly different in terms of a standard house. I mentioned previously, the client has to want to do the passive house. It's voluntary, so they have to come to us and say, this is something I want to do, be it for one reason or another. And they have to be, it's like onboarding, so you're onboarding the client to say, well, if you want to do this, then there's certain things you have to do. It's the same when you get a contractor on the job, so that the contractor has to be willing to do the work that makes it a passive house. And in general, it's not a difficult task. Most builders would be competent enough to build it. It's the difficult section is making sure that they are on board and taking on what you're saying to them. So that the key things like the airtight membrane that's on the project has to be maintained. On a standard house, you'll find there's rips all over the membranes, externally and internally. That can't happen because as soon as something's covered up and there's a tear in there, and then you go to do your airtightness testing, the first one, you'll see that there's a leakage somewhere. And then we do the second one. If that's not been addressed, then you have to go back in there and you have to find out where that tear is. So it's basically, if you have the contractor on board, then they know what's required of them, so that they can go around and go to their subcontractor, you can't do that, you need to fix that, or you need to be more careful.
So presumably then there's an element of, I mean, that's all about good practice and good workmanship, but there must be some element of education or training that's required for contractors to be able to meet this passive house standard.
So there's organisations like Best at the moment, they're doing training, practical training for contractors to bring them up to state with, like you say, good practice, saying this is how we do this type of detail, and they're giving them a chance to actually do it. Now, all these guys are experienced builders, but it's just giving them a new tool set to go out and say, well, if we're going to be building passive house, then we need to think of all these different ways of doing it to make sure that it's compliant, rather than just doing what we do normally.
Yeah, I mean, it's coming to Scotland, so that would mean that contractors who want to build houses, and some of your bigger contractors who are building, commercial buildings to this kind of passive house standard, would also need to have, be very mindful that that's coming, and B, probably start putting their subcontractors through as many training courses as they possibly can.
I did a practical training a couple of years ago, and there was a lot of the tier 1 contractors in for the schools, so they were doing the same training as I was, just to kind of have an experience. And at that point, it was the sort of management level. They were going in just to see what would be different from what they're doing. And at that point, it was them learning, okay, well, this is slightly different. And from then, I believe that there's been about 2 or 3 new schools built in that time period. So they've obviously kind of still a learning curve as it's going on the job, but it's been a steep learning curve. And I think a couple of them are now finished, and a couple more are at the stage of being snagged. So the progress has been made.
Yeah, there are a few good educational videos on YouTube from Passive House that explain some of the challenges and difficulties and the solutions that they've went through to with those projects you're just talking about. So if we're looking at an existing building, John, can these be upgraded to a Passive House standard?
They can, yes. The problem again is it's a voluntary system, so there's no funding there for you if you want to do it. So it's have to be self-funded. There are other systems out there if you want to do a high energy performance upgrade, like the PASS system, Passivhaus-certified, that can be provided with government funding. But there's the Enerfit system, which is there to provide a basis, a methodic basis, similar to the standard passive house, that you can basically use the passive house planning package to design a retrofit for an existing building.
Right. So is there a definitive date yet as to when Passivhaus Scotland will come into place?
Not yet, no. There's this process is still ongoing, but I can't really give you an answer on that at the moment. So
I think the thing we could say though is that over the last 3 years in particular, maybe longer, through the building control regulations, we're seeing a huge increase in the requirements in terms of energy performance of buildings, even although we're not at passive house standard at this moment in time. And certainly I think there's been some contractors that we've been working with who have found that transition rather difficult. The whole thing of, seeing a set of drawings and then building things the way they've always built them, not necessarily referring to drawings and finding that actually what they've built may have complied at one point, but doesn't currently comply, doesn't comply with the warrant that's been approved. So I think that's one of the wee difficulties I've got in my head, is to understand how, well, it's not to understand, we know what's going to have to happen. Contractors are going to have to make themselves much more aware of the changes that they're going to have to do on site in terms of how they're manufacturing, putting details together on site.
Yep. In general terms, we often find that contractors will change insulation, for example. We think it's a like for like, but they might change the thickness of it. It might be a slightly different energy performance. Under the passive house planning package, you need to know what that is so that you can equate that through the entire building. Just making a simple change in a U-value calc is not the same as changing it on a passive house building, because it's a full design. It's like I said earlier, it's one thing changes, it affects something else. So we just have to ensure that the contractors are aware of that.
Yeah, so it's a bit like the ripple effect of throwing a stone in a pond. We've got to calculate and measure the total effect.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So probably the interesting thing then for us as architects, because it's, I guess as architects, this was our primary role, is to look after the design. So does a passive house need to look boring? Can it be exciting?
It doesn't have to look boring at all, no. The key thing, if you were designing a very efficient building, is the shape of the building. The more intricate, the more ins and outs of a building, the more complex it is. You can still design a passive house, but it'll be difficult. It'll be more challenging. It's not to say it's impossible, it's just that you have to work harder for it.
Yeah, I think as architects, that's what we do though. That's our training, is to look at fundamentally challenging problems and come up with interesting design solutions. And probably passive house is the next challenging theme for buildings in Scotland and the UK. And I think there's going to be a lot of interesting solutions coming up from architects.
In terms of the clients that we have, there's a kind of specific style that we're doing at the moment. And a simple geometry in that is not always the easiest option for them. So if a passive house was to be chosen for some of these house types, it could work and it would work, but you just have to, as I say, work that wee bit harder to get it to work.
Okay. If someone was approaching block or thinking about doing a passive house, and obviously thinking about coming to Block Architects, what's the one key thing you would ask them to bring with them to the first meeting?
I'd say an open mind. They've got to have a desire to do it. They can't just have an idea of, I want to do a passive house and then not really know what it is. They have to do a wee bit of research to find out why they would want to do it. Obviously, with the regulations changing, they would have to do it. But at the moment, without the regulations being in place, it's still voluntary. So they still have to have a reason for why they would want to do it, and it can't be just because I want to. There must be a desire there, because it's not something that's a straightforward process. Just building a house is already difficult. So if you've got something in mind and you just want to add that on, I wouldn't suggest doing it. I would suggest that it's a desire rather than just a nice to have.
So have a big why.
Yeah.
Have a big why, and do they need to have deeper pockets at this moment in time?
Presently, slightly deeper, and that's due to the materials being available. It's again, with the schools being built and more housing associations building passive house, the market is starting to grow for the materials and the resources. But until it becomes a mass production of passive houses, then there will be a slight additional cost. But Passive House Trust have done investigations and surveys into it, and at the moment it's not a significant increase.
Right.
And the more that you actually build them, the cheaper it is.
Okay.
So if you're doing a one-off house, it might be slightly more expensive, but if you're doing a larger development, it's actually been found it's cheaper.
Okay, well that's interesting to know. So that's us, folks. Kenneth Martin from Block Architects, John Burns, our Passive House specialist. If you've got any questions or queries on Passive House in Scotland that's coming up, do reach out to us via our webpage, or you'll catch us on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Thank you.